Nós, estudantes do curso de Relações Internacionais da PUC São Paulo e integrantes do grupo de estudo sobre conflitos internacionais, em parceria com o Democracy Now!, apresentaremos as principais notícias da semana.
A partir de agora, com legendas em português, vincularemos os principais destaques internacionais.
From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I want to tell kids at the border and all over the country not to give up and fight for their families. We are all human and deserve to be loved and cared for.
This is not who we are or who we should be. And the thing is that there's one person who has the absolute ability to change this right now. And that's President Donald Trump.
On Father's Day, Democratic lawmakers joined hundreds who protested outside child detention centers along the Texas-Mexico border, where families have been separated under Trump's new policy, zero tolerance. We'll speak with a whistleblower, a youth care worker who quit a Tucson detention center for unaccompanied minors, run by the nonprofit Southwest Key Programs, which also runs the 1,500-person facility in Brownsville, and a proposed baby jail in Houston, 27 shelters in total. Antar Davidson quit after he says Southwest Key forced him to tell children who were separated from their mother and then from their siblings not to hug. Then to Yemen, where a U.S.-backed, Saudi-led coalition has launched an all-out offensive against the key port city of Hodeidah, where the most humanitarian supplies pass through, forcing thousands to flee their homes.
Me, my kids, my siblings, mother, father, and my cousins, the whole village left. But almost half of us went back with the elderly. The children couldn't take it. Those who died, died, and those who survived, survived. Those who were killed are in the refrigerator at the hospital.
As humanitarian groups warn of a catastrophe for the 250,000 civilians living in Hodeidah amidst a conflict that's already killed 15,000 civilians, we'll speak with Yemeni scholar Shireen Aladimi, whose recent report is headlined "Attack on Yemen Port Shows U.S.-Backed Coalition Willing to Use Starvation as a Weapon." All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Outrage is mounting over the Trump administration's practice of separating immigrant children from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border as part of a crackdown against immigrants and asylum seekers. The Associated Press reports nearly 2,000 children have been separated from their parents since April 19th. The New York Times is reporting some parents have been deported without their children and with no information about how the family will be reunited. On Friday, Vice President Mike Pence was interrupted by opponents of family separation during a speech in Columbus, Ohio.
Including our historic tax cuts. Let's hear it for America First policies that brought all of us here together today. But I'm here today first and foremost. I'm here today first and foremost to say thank you. Thank you to almost all of you.
People were yelling through Pence's speech, "Why are you ripping children from their families?" Over the weekend, there were protests at detention centers nationwide. In Texas, Democratic Congressmember Beto O'Rourke and former El Paso County Judge Veronica Escobar helped lead a march to a newly opened tent city where migrant children are being held. Hundreds of protesters also rallied at a family processing center in McAllen, Texas, while hundreds more protested in Houston outside a former warehouse and homeless shelter where the government plans to detain hundreds of separated children. Meanwhile, in New Jersey, a group of Democratic lawmakers visited a private immigrant detention facility in the town of Elizabeth to speak with asylum-seeking parents held there after they were separated from their children. This all comes as, in South Texas, at least 5 people died Sunday when an SUV carrying undocumented immigrants crashed after being chased at high speeds by Border Patrol agents. We'll have more on all the protests and growing outrage over the family detention and separation of children from their families after headlines. We'll speak with a whistleblower who quit his job at a Tucson detention center for unaccompanied minors and separated children. In Afghanistan, civilians celebrated an unprecedented 3-day ceasefire between the Afghan government and the Taliban during the weekend's Eid celebrations. It was the first nationwide lull in hostilities between the two parties since the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001. Over the weekend, Taliban and government fighters celebrated the ceasefire and gathered for joint festivities marking the end of Ramadan. Despite the ceasefire, there were at least 2 suicide bombings by ISIS militants, including a car bombing targeting a gathering of Taliban and Afghan soldiers in the eastern city of Nangarhar that killed 26 people. The Taliban said Sunday it will not extend the ceasefire. In Yemen, there are reports hundreds of fighters have been killed and more than 4,000 civilians have been forced to flee their homes since the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition launched an all-out offensive against the key port city of Hodeidah nearly a week ago. Early this morning, coalition aircraft bombarded Hodeida's main airport, wounding dozens, preventing aid organizations from reaching parts of the city. This is Yahya Tanani, who was forced to flee with his family.
Me, my kids, my siblings, mother, father, and my cousins, the whole village left. But almost half of us went back with the elderly. The children couldn't take it. Those who died, died, and those who survived, survived. Those who were killed are in the refrigerator at the hospital. We know of 10 to 15 bodies that are in the refrigerators, and we don't know who our enemy is.
International groups have warned the U.S.-backed offensive to seize the key port city of Hodeidah will exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, which is already experiencing the world's worst cholera epidemic, with more than 1 million people afflicted and with millions more on the brink of famine. We'll have more on Yemen later in the broadcast. In Nigeria, at least 31 people were killed in twin suicide bomb attacks in the northeast state of Borno. The suspected Boko Haram attack targeted people returning from Eid celebrations Sunday night. India is facing its worst water shortage crisis in its history. That's according to a new report from an Indian government think tank, which says as many as 200,000 people die in India every year from a lack of access to clean water. The report also says 600 million people in India are facing acute water shortages, and that 21 Indian cities are expected to run out of groundwater by 2020. In Colombia, right-wing politician Ivan Duque has won Sunday's contentious presidential runoff, beating out his left-leaning challenger, Gustavo Petro, in an election that'll determine the future of Colombia's historic peace deal with the FARC. Duque was handpicked by former right-wing President Álvaro Uribe. Duque has vowed to roll back key parts of the peace deal. He's also opposed to drug legalization. In Spain, about 600 refugees have finally disembarked in the port city of Valencia after being stranded at sea for over a week when the new right-wing Italian government blocked them from arriving in Italy. On Sunday, Pope Francis demanded a global pact to protect refugees.
Mercoledì prossimo
Next Wednesday will be World Refugee Day, promoted by the United Nations to draw attention to what our brothers, who are forced to flee their land because of conflicts and persecution, live through often, with great anxiety and suffering. This year, this day falls in the wake of consultations between governments for the adoption of a global pact on refugees that is due to be adopted within the year, a pact for safe, orderly, and regular migration.
Israel's introduced new legislation to make it illegal for human rights groups to film Israeli soldiers in order to document human rights violations. The proposed law would criminalize both filming and publishing footage, with a maximum 5-year prison sentence. This is Amit Galutz with the human rights group B'Tselem.
The problem is not with the documentation of reality, but with reality itself, the reality in which Israel is holding 5 million people with no political rights indefinitely for generation after generation under its military control. If the occupation embarrasses the Israeli government, it is welcome to work to end the occupation. But the documentation of human rights violations happening under the occupation will continue nonetheless.
Back in the United States, longtime political cartoonist Rob Rogers has been fired from his job at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette after 25 years in what he says was a response to his critical cartoons about President Trump. Among his recent sketches that his editors refused to publish was one that depicted a caution sign with a silhouette of Trump snatching a small refugee child, and a Memorial Day cartoon in which Trump is laying a wreath in front of a gravestone for truth, honor, and rule of law. In Detroit, thousands of independent media makers gathered for the 20th anniversary of the Allied Media Conference over the weekend. The annual conference began in 1999 as the Midwest Zine Conference and has since grown into one of the biggest gatherings of independent media makers in the country. This is Linda Campbell of Detroit People's Platform.
In this time in America, just to be able to know that there still exists and we're able to create spaces to build together, to talk about our different movements and the intersections across different movements, both here nationally and across the world. It's also a space where a lot of young people of color gather, and that's encouraging at times when some of our communities of color are under attack, particularly our immigrant communities.
In New York City, a taxicab driver has died by suicide as Wall Street-backed ride-hailing services like Uber and Lyft have pushed longtime taxicab drivers to financial ruin. The 59-year-old man, Abdul Salah, was a Yemeni immigrant who'd been driving a taxi for 30 years. He was found dead in his Brooklyn apartment on Friday morning. He's the sixth taxicab driver to die by suicide in New York City in recent months. And in Pennsylvania, Move member Debbie Africa has been granted parole and was released from prison after a decades-long campaign to win her freedom. Debbie Africa was imprisoned for nearly 40 years after being arrested during a massive police raid on the Philadelphia Move House in 1978, during which one police officer was killed. At the time of her arrest, she was 22 years old and was 8.5 months pregnant with her son, Mike Jr. After her release Saturday, Debbie Africa is reunited with her son, Mike, for the first time outside prison walls in their entire lives. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
They went in that morning ready to kill and be killed on behalf of America. To their credit, they landed. There were just nothing but women and children doing the usual, as you said in your intro, cooking, warming up rice for breakfast. And they began to put them in ditches and start executing them. Callie's company, Callie had a platoon. There were 3 platoons that went in. They rounded up people and put them in a ditch. The other companies just went along and didn't gather people, just went from house to house and killed and raped and mutilated. And it just went on until everybody was either run away or killed, 400 and some odd people in that village alone.
Today, an hour with the legendary Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist Seymour Hersh. He broke the stories about the My Lai massacre, the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, the CIA's secret surveillance of anti-war activists, and much more. He's out with a new memoir. It's called Reporter.
First of all, the obsession with Trump dominates all kinds of other reporting. They're finally getting to one of the issues with the immigration. The newspapers are finally reeling on that instead of just dwelling on his tweets, which is what his game is. I tweet and you moan about it.
Today, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh for the hour. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Nationwide outrage and protests are mounting over the Trump administration's practice of forcibly separating immigrant children from their parents at the U.S.-Mexico border in violation of international human rights law. On Tuesday, Republican and Democratic governors of 8 states, Maryland, Massachusetts, Virginia, Rhode Island, Colorado, New York, North Carolina, and Connecticut, say they would either withhold or recall their National Guard troops from the border in protest of the practice of separating children. Border Patrol says it separated more than 2,300 kids in the last 2 months. The Intercept reports the Trump administration has separated at least 3,700 immigrant children from their parents since last October, many of whom have come to the United States seeking asylum. The separated children have been sent to at least 17 different states' detention facilities. The Associated Press reports babies and toddlers are being detained in 3 so-called baby jails in South Texas, in Brownsville, Raymondville, and Combs, with a 4th baby jail slated to open soon in Houston. The government calls them tender-age shelters. Many of the children are under 1 year old. On Tuesday, President Trump continued his xenophobic Twitter rant, tweeting, "Democrats are the problem. They don't care about crime and want illegal immigrants, no matter how bad they may be, to pour into and infest our country," unquote. Conservative editor Bill Kristol tweeted, "Trump's statement that immigrants will infest our country probably sounds better in the original German." This is Trump speaking on Tuesday.
When countries abuse us by sending their people up, not their best, we're not going to give any more aid to those countries. Why the hell should we? Why should
As many are accusing Trump of holding the refugee children hostage to pass funding for his border wall, Trump met with Republican lawmakers on Capitol Hill Tuesday. House Republicans are vowing to press ahead with votes this week on 2 different sweeping anti-immigrant bills. President Trump has indicated he will stop the family separation practice in exchange for $25 billion for Trump's border wall, a crackdown on asylum seekers, and a reduction on visas to the United States. Not a single Republican lawmaker reportedly raised the issue of family separation with Trump during the meeting Tuesday. Democrats are demanding the passage of standalone legislation to stop the separation of families, or that President Trump simply stop the practice himself, as it was his administration that enacted the zero-tolerance policy that began the widespread separation of families. While Trump left his meeting with Republicans on Capitol Hill, he was heckled by lawmakers with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus who shouted, "Mr. President, don't you have kids?"
Mr. President, don't you have kids? Don't you have kids, Mr. President?
They also yelled, "Stop separating children." Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen was also heckled Tuesday at a Mexican restaurant in Washington, D.C. by protesters who shouted, "Shame on you."
Family separation.
How does that make you feel?
Shame on you.
Shame on you.
Shame.
Have you listened to it? Do you hear the babies crying?
The protesters were also yelling, "Have you listened to the audio yet? And do you hear the babies crying?" References to the audio released by ProPublica, in which separated children are crying "Mama" and "Papi" from inside a detention center. Meanwhile, more than 600 members of the United Methodist Church have filed a formal complaint against fellow church member Attorney General Jeff Sessions, accusing him of child abuse, immorality, and racial discrimination for the Trump administration's practice of separating immigrant children from their families. Sessions was also heckled while receiving a Lifetime Achievement Award by the National Sheriff's Association in New Orleans Monday by protesters who shouted, "Stop taking kids."
As they stand in peaceful protest.
5 protesters were arrested protesting outside the National Sheriff's Association convention, while inside, Attorney General Jeff Sessions hailed the Sheriff's Association's Anglo-American heritage. Hundreds of protesters also gathered in cities across the country Tuesday, including in San Francisco, New York, Philadelphia, El Paso, Texas, Washington, D.C., and Portland, Oregon, to denounce the practice of separating refugee children from their parents. Mental health professionals are also continuing to denounce the practice. This is Catherine Hampton with Physicians for Human Rights.
The negative impact on functioning of children can even continue into adulthood. It can impact their academic achievement. It can have a long-term impact on their ability to have normal attachment to family members and loved ones. And the psychological quality of life is devastated.
Mexican officials say one of the children who's been separated from her parents is a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome. This is Trump's former campaign manager, Corey Lewandowski, mocking the story of this girl on Fox News. This clip begins with former senior Democratic National Committee advisor Zach Petkanis.
I read today about a 10-year-old girl with Down syndrome who was taken from her mother and put in a cage. I read about did you say want to a 10-year-old with Down syndrome being taken from her mother?
What I said is you can pick anything you want, but the bottom line is very clear.
How dare you?
U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley has announced the United States is withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council, accusing the council of being biased against Israel.
For too long, the Human Rights Council has been a protector of human rights abusers and a cesspool of political bias. Regrettably, it is now clear that our call for reform was not heeded.
The announcement of the withdrawal comes only one day after the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights slammed the Trump administration for the, quote, unconscionable, unquote, separation of children from their parents. The Trump administration's been threatening for months to withdraw from the human rights body, which has repeatedly condemned Israel for its treatment of Palestinians, including its bloody crackdown against nonviolent protesters in Gaza. This is Philip Alston, UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty, speaking on Democracy Now!
If you've got 8 countries in the entire world who don't think that Israel should have been condemned for these actions, you need to ask, why are these 8 going against all the others? And those 8 consist of the United States, Australia, and 6 other very small countries, very small players. Essentially, all of the countries of Western Europe, all of the United States allies joined in the United Nations action in relation to Israel.
That was Philip Alston, UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty. He'll be testifying before the UN Human Rights Council on Thursday. In Canada, the Senate has approved legislation to legalize marijuana, meaning Canada will soon become the second country in the world to legalize the drug nationwide. The first was Uruguay. The Guardian reports nearly 500,000 Canadians have marijuana convictions on their criminal record. Criminal justice activists are advocating for those with prior convictions to be granted amnesty as the new law goes into effect, arguing the outdated marijuana laws had a disproportionate effect on people of color and the poor. Meanwhile, in New York City, Mayor Bill de Blasio is under fire for saying Tuesday that New York Police Department plans to end marijuana arrests for some people, but continue arresting some New Yorkers who've passed arrests or convictions. In response to Mayor de Blasio's announcement about new policies for marijuana arrests, Vocal New York and the Drug Policy Alliance released a statement saying, quote, "It's frustrating that as the New York State Health Department moves toward legalization, the city is continuing its shameful history of racist marijuana enforcement," unquote. Activists and community members will gather today at noon on the steps of City Hall to protest the new marijuana policy. In Yemen, a U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition says it seized the airport in the crucial port city of Hodeidah. Hundreds of fighters have been killed. Thousands of civilians have been forced to flee their homes since the U.S.-backed Saudi-led coalition launched an all-out offensive against Hodeidah a week ago. International groups have warned the U.S.-backed offensive to seize Hodeidah will exacerbate the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, which is already experiencing the worst cholera epidemic in the world, with more than 1 million people afflicted and with millions more on the brink of famine. Meanwhile, the Associated Press reports rampant sexual abuse in a South Yemen jail controlled by the United Arab Emirates. AP reports that in March 15th, officers lined up the prisoners in the southern city of Aden and ordered them to undress before searching their anal cavities, claiming they were looking for contraband cell phones. The men screamed and cried, and those who resisted were beaten and threatened with dogs. AP reports hundreds of prisoners suffered similar abuse. And back in the United States, Charleston, South Carolina, has apologized for its role in the transatlantic slave trade. About 40% of enslaved Africans forcibly brought to North America were trafficked through Charleston. On Tuesday, the Charleston City Council passed a resolution recognizing that the city flourished and profited at the cost of enslaved people. The council passed the resolution in Charleston City Hall, which was built by enslaved people. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report.
Nosso programa fica por aqui. Você pode acompanhar a gente pela nossa página no Facebook ou pelo blog Terra em Transe.
Nos vemos na próxima semana. Até lá.
O projeto surgiu com o auxílio do professor, que passou um trabalho para a gente fazer a ponte, né? Que é a ponte arqueada de Leonardo da Vinci.
Isso foi muito enriquecedor para a gente, porque a gente conseguiu colocar em prática os conceitos da disciplina.
O nosso projeto, além de ter o aspecto técnico-científico, ele teve uma inspiração, o biomimetismo. O biomimetismo, basicamente, é a execução de projetos onde você busca alguma inspiração na natureza para tornar isso funcional e criar um projeto. Por exemplo, tem uma curva, né? Ela existe porque aquele formato consegue fazer com que o peso, a carga, seja distribuído de forma uniforme, ou seja, ele não vai quebrar.
O projeto foi baseado em 3 etapas. A primeira foi a busca de referências bibliográficas. Depois disso, a gente fez um protótipo para poder dimensionar. E a terceira etapa foi a realização da ponte em tamanho real.
Os módulos são compostos por 3 peças. Uma na horizontal, que é uma trava inteira, e 2 na lateral, que possui 3 encaixes.
A gente viu que se fizesse uma seção retangular, a área, a seção que receberia carga, seria muito menor. Então a gente resolveu fazer em formato de arco, que assim os esforços solicitantes se distribuiriam melhor na seção. E temos também a barra onde nós temos os pés, né, que são os apoios. A gente utilizou um material polimérico para criar atrito, né, que é mais um dos conceitos que a gente aprendeu que são pertinentes à matéria estudada.
A nova forma de educação e engenharia dá muito enfoque exatamente ao trabalho em grupo e principalmente às competências que são desenvolvidas quando os alunos pesquisam.
Justamente por ser uma ponte arqueada de Leonardo da Vinci, essa releitura proporcionou essa experiência cultural também. Essa interdisciplinaridade proporcionou para a gente o desenvolvimento das habilidades não só exatas, que são requeridas pelo curso, mas o desenvolvimento de outras habilidades humanas, que são fundamentais depois para a sua atuação profissional. Tem sido uma experiência muito enriquecedora fazer o curso de Engenharia Civil aqui.